The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Connecticut, as Margaret O'Sullivan watched her husband Thomas load the milk truck with practiced efficiency. It was April 15, 1987, and the spring air carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees that lined their modest neighborhood. "You forgot your thermos again," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the gentle teasing tone that had characterized their 23 years of marriage. At 52, she still found herself mothering the man who had stolen her heart when she was just 19. Thomas turned, his weathered face breaking into the familiar grin that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago. His blue work shirt was already damp with sweat despite the early hour, and his graying hair stuck up at odd angles from running his hands through it, a habit he'd developed when he was thinking. "What would I do without you, Maggie?" he said, accepting the thermos and planting a quick kiss on her forehead. "Don't know why I even bother getting dressed in the morning, if you're not there to straighten me out." Margaret smoothed down his collar, a gesture so automatic it had become second nature. "You'd probably show up to work in your pajamas," she replied, but her smile faltered slightly. She'd been having trouble sleeping lately, plagued by dreams she couldn't quite remember, but that left her feeling unsettled. Thomas noticed the change in her expression immediately. After more than 2 decades together, he could read her moods like the morning newspaper. "You okay, sweetheart? You've been tossing and turning a lot lately." "Just worried about the Henderson account," she lied smoothly. The truth was more complicated, a nagging feeling that something was about to change, though she couldn't put her finger on what. "You know how Mrs. Henderson gets when her cream delivery is even 5 minutes late." Thomas chuckled, but his eyes remained concerned. "I'll make sure she's the first stop today. Promise." As he climbed into the truck, Margaret felt an unusual urge to ask him to stay home. The feeling was so strong it surprised her. Thomas had been making this same route for 15 years, and she'd never felt anxious about it before. But before she could voice her concern, he was already backing out of the driveway, one hand on the wheel and the other waving goodbye. "Love you, Maggie," he called out through the open window. "Love you too," she called back, watching as the familiar white truck disappeared around the corner of Elm Street. Margaret stood in the driveway for a moment longer, that strange feeling of unease settling in her chest like a stone. She shook her head, trying to dispel the melancholy that had crept over her. There was laundry to do, groceries to buy, and a casserole to prepare for the church potluck that evening. 3 blocks away, Thomas was already deep into his route, humming an old Johnny Cash song under his breath. He'd been a milkman for most of his adult life, taking over the route from his father when he was just 25. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it had provided a comfortable life for him and Margaret. His first stop was at the Pemberton Mansion on Hillcrest Drive, a sprawling colonial that sat onto acres of meticulously maintained grounds. Charles and Victoria Pemberton had been customers for about 8 years, ever since they'd moved to Millbrook from New York City. Charles was some kind of investment banker, and Victoria came from old money, the kind of people who had never had to worry about paying bills or choosing between heating and groceries. Thomas pulled into the circular driveway, noting that Charles's black Mercedes was already gone. The man kept banker's hours, leaving for the city before dawn and returning well after dark. Thomas had always felt a little sorry for Victoria, stuck in that big house all day with nothing but the housekeeper for company. He grabbed 2 bottles of milk and a container of heavy cream from the truck, making his way to the side door that led to the kitchen. The Pembertons preferred their deliveries to be left in the mudroom, where their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, would retrieve them. As he approached the door, Thomas heard something that made him stop in his tracks, the sound of a baby crying. He stood still for a moment, listening. The crying was coming from inside the house, but Thomas was certain the Pembertons didn't have children. In all the years he'd been delivering to them, he'd never seen or heard any evidence of kids. The crying continued, a desperate, hungry sound that tugged at something deep in Thomas's chest. He and Margaret had tried for years to have children, enduring disappointment after disappointment until the doctors had finally confirmed what they'd both begun to suspect: Margaret couldn't carry a pregnancy to term. Thomas knocked on the door harder than he usually did. After a moment, Mrs. Chen appeared, her usually composed demeanor slightly frazzled. "Mr. O'Sullivan," she said, accepting the milk delivery. "Thank you. Is everything all right?" Thomas asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice. "I heard crying." Mrs. Chen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everything is fine. Thank you for the delivery." She started to close the door, but Thomas held up a hand. "Mrs. Chen, if there's a baby in distress, there's no baby," she said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, it's complicated." The crying intensified, and Thomas could see the conflict playing out on the older woman's face. Mrs. Chen had worked for the Pembertons for 5 years, and Thomas had always found her to be kind and straightforward. She wasn't the type to lie. Without good reason. "Mrs. Chen," Thomas said gently, "I'm not trying to pry, but that baby sounds like it needs help." The housekeeper looked around nervously, then stepped outside and closed the door behind her. "Promise me you won't say anything to anyone," she whispered urgently. Thomas nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was promising. "Mrs. Pemberton, she had a baby 3 weeks ago, but she's not well. She won't feed him, won't hold him. She just lies in bed all day, staring at the wall. Mr. Pemberton hired a nurse, but she quit yesterday. Said she couldn't handle Mrs. Pemberton's condition." The pieces were starting to fall into place. "Postpartum depression," Thomas said quietly. His sister had suffered from it after her second child, and he remembered how frightening it had been for the whole family. Mrs. Chen nodded. "I'm doing my best, but I don't know anything about babies. And Mr. Pemberton, he's talking about finding someone else to take care of the child permanently." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I think he wants to give the baby away. He says his wife may never recover, and he can't handle a sick wife and a baby. He's been making phone calls, talking to lawyers about options." The baby's crying reached a crescendo, and Thomas found himself stepping toward the door. "Can I see him?" Mrs. Chen hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a minute. But if Mr. Pemberton comes home—" "I understand." Thomas followed Mrs. Chen through the mudroom and into the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet except for the baby's cries, which were coming from upstairs. Mrs. Chen led him up the servants' staircase to a small room that had been hastily converted into a nursery. The baby was lying in a crib, his tiny fists waving in the air as he cried. He was small, probably premature. Thomas thought with a shock of dark hair and the reddest little face he'd ever seen. Despite the crying, Thomas could see that he was beautiful. "What's his name?" Thomas asked, reaching into the crib to gently stroke the baby's cheek. The crying stopped immediately, and the infant's dark eyes focused on Thomas's face with surprising intensity. "They haven't named him," Mrs. Chen said sadly. "Mrs. Pemberton won't even look at him. She calls him it when she refers to him at all." Thomas felt a surge of anger so strong it surprised him. How could anyone look at this perfect little person and not fall in love immediately? He gently picked up the baby, who nestled against his chest with a small sigh. "He's hungry," Thomas said, noting the way the baby was rooting against his shirt. "I know. I've been trying to feed him, but he won't take the bottle. I think he's getting sick." Thomas looked down at the baby in his arms, and something shifted inside him. This child needed help, needed love, needed someone to fight for him. And looking at Mrs. Chen's worried face, he realized that the baby wasn't going to get what he needed in this house. "Mrs. Chen," Thomas said slowly, "what if I told you I knew someone who could help? Someone who would love this baby like he deserves to be loved?" The housekeeper's eyes widened. "You mean permanently?" "I mean exactly that. My wife and we've always wanted children. We give this little one everything he needs." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Thomas and the baby. Mr. Pemberton would never agree to that. He'd want to go through an agency, find a family that meets his standards. What standards? Rich standards, connected standards. He's already been talking to his lawyer about finding a family in their social circle. Thomas felt the baby's tiny hand curl around his finger, and his resolve hardened. This baby doesn't need rich parents. He needs parents who will love him. "I agree," Mrs. Chen said softly, but I don't have any say in this. I'm just the housekeeper." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he looked up at Mrs. Chen with a determination that surprised them both. "What if we didn't give Mr. Pemberton a choice?" "What do you mean?" "What if this baby just disappeared? What if he was somewhere safe, with people who would love him?" Before Mr. Pemberton could hand him over to strangers, Mrs. Chen's face went pale. "Mr. O'Sullivan, that's kidnapping." "No," Thomas said firmly. "That's saving a life. Look at him, Mrs. Chen. Really look at him. He's not getting what he needs here. Mrs. Pemberton is too sick to care for him, and Mr. Pemberton wants to treat him like a problem to be solved. This baby deserves better." The baby made a small cooing sound, and Thomas felt his heart break. A little. He thought of Margaret, of all the years they'd tried to have a child, of all the nights he'd held her while she cried over another miscarriage. This baby needed parents, and they needed a baby. It seemed like the simplest thing in the world. "I can't ask you to do that," Mrs. Chen said. But Thomas could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "You're not asking. I'm offering. Margaret and we give this little one everything. Love, security, a real home. We'd raise him right." Mrs. Chen looked at the baby in Thomas's arms, and her expression softened. "He is a beautiful child, and he does need someone to fight for him. Then help me fight for him." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "What would you need me to do?" Thomas felt a surge of hope. "Just don't be here when Mr. Pemberton comes home. Take a long lunch, visit a friend, do some shopping. Give me time to get the baby somewhere safe. And then you tell Mr. Pemberton that you came back and found the baby gone. You don't know what happened. Maybe Mrs. Pemberton finally came to her senses and took him somewhere. Maybe someone broke in. You just don't know." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "I could do that. But Mr. O'Sullivan, what about later, when he starts asking questions involving the police?" Thomas had been thinking about that too. "By then, this little one will be safe and loved, and I'll deal with whatever comes after." The baby had fallen asleep in Thomas's arms, his tiny face peaceful for the first time since Thomas had arrived. Looking down at him, Thomas felt a certainty he'd never experienced before. This was meant to be. This baby was meant to be his and Margaret's son. "All right," Mrs. Chen said finally. "I'll leave at 11 and not come back until 3. That should give you enough time." Thomas nodded, gently placing the baby back in the crib. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You're doing the right thing." "I hope so," she said quietly. "That little one deserves a chance at happiness." As Thomas drove away from the Pemberton house, his mind was racing. He had for hours to figure out how to tell Margaret that they were about to become parents, and to prepare for the biggest decision of their lives. The baby's cries echoed in his memory, but so did the feeling of the tiny hand curled around his finger. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Thomas had made up his mind. He was going to save that baby, and he was going to give him the family he deserved. The only question now was whether Margaret would agree to take the biggest leap of faith either of them had ever taken. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared lunch. She looked up as he entered, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "Thomas, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas took her hands in his, feeling the weight of what he was about to ask her. "Maggie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen with an open heart. You're scaring me. Don't be scared. What I'm about to tell you, it might be the answer to our prayers, but it's going to require us to be braver than we've ever been." Margaret searched his face, seeing something there she'd never seen before, a desperate hope mixed with absolute determination. "Tell me," she said simply. And so Thomas began to tell her about the baby, about the crying, about Mrs. Chen's revelation, and about the opportunity that had been placed before them. As he spoke, he watched Margaret's expression change from confusion to understanding to something that looked like wonder. When he finished, they stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. "Show me," Margaret said finally. "I want to see him." Thomas squeezed her hands. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. If this baby needs us, and we need him, then maybe this is how it's supposed to be." As they drove toward the Pemberton house, Thomas felt a sense of rightness he'd never experienced before. Whatever happened next, he knew they were about to change not just their own lives, but the life of a baby who needed them just as much as they needed him. The first chapter of their new life was about to begin. The drive to the Pemberton house felt both endless and too short. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching the familiar streets of Millbrook pass by with new eyes. Everything looked the same, but she felt as if she was seeing it all for the first time, the way the afternoon sunlight filtered through the maple trees, the children playing in front yards, the quiet suburban normalcy that had been her world for over 2 decades. "Are you having second thoughts?" Thomas asked, glancing at her as he turned onto Hillcrest Drive. Margaret considered the question seriously. Was she? 20 minutes ago, she'd been preparing tuna sandwiches and thinking about what to wear to the church potluck. Now she was potentially about to become a mother to a baby she'd never met, in circumstances that were, at best, morally complex. "No," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm not having second thoughts. I'm having every thought, but not second thoughts." Thomas smiled at that. It was such a Margaret thing to say, even in the most emotional moments. She had a way of finding the exact right words. The Pemberton house loomed ahead, its imposing facade somehow different now that Margaret knew what was inside. She'd driven past this house hundreds of times, had probably never given it more than a passing glance. Now it looked like a fortress, beautiful but cold. Exactly the kind of place where a baby might cry and no one would hear. "Mrs. Chen should be gone by now," Thomas said, checking his watch. It was 11:30, and they'd seen her pass them in her small Honda Civic about 5 minutes earlier, heading toward downtown. Thomas parked in the circular driveway, and they sat for a moment in the silence. Margaret could feel her heart beating so hard she was sure Thomas could hear it. "What if we can't do this?" she asked suddenly. "What if we're not good enough? What if, Maggie?" Thomas turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "Do you remember what you told me when we first found out we couldn't have children?" She nodded, her eyes filling with tears at the memory. It had been the worst day of her life, sitting in that sterile doctor's office while he explained the test results in clinical terms that couldn't begin to capture the devastation she felt. "You said that maybe our baby was out there somewhere, waiting for us to find him. You said that maybe we were meant to be parents in a different way." "I remember." Her voice was barely a whisper. "What if this is what you meant? What if this baby has been waiting for us all along?" Margaret looked at the house, then back at Thomas, in his weathered face. She saw the same desperate hope she'd been carrying for years, the same bone-deep longing for a child to love. But she also saw something else, a fierce protectiveness that told her he'd already fallen in love with a baby he'd held for 5 minutes. "Let's go meet our son," she said. Thomas had kept a key to the Pemberton house for emergencies, a common practice with his longtime customers as they let themselves in through the kitchen door. Margaret was struck by how quiet the house was. It was the kind of expensive silence that came from thick carpets and heavy curtains, but underneath it, she could hear something that made her breath catch. Crying. Not the angry, demanding cry of a hungry baby, but something weaker, more desperate. The sound of someone who was giving up. "Oh, God," Margaret whispered. And before Thomas could stop her, she was running up the stairs toward the sound. She found the nursery easily. It was the only room with an open door, as if Mrs. Chen had left it that way on purpose. Margaret stopped in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, and stared at the most beautiful baby she'd ever seen. He was so small, lying in a crib that seemed far too big for him. His dark hair was matted with sweat, and his tiny face was red from crying. But when he saw Margaret, he stopped crying for just a moment, his dark eyes focusing on her face with an intensity that took her breath away. "Hello, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, moving toward the crib. "Hello, beautiful boy." The baby made a soft sound, not quite a cry but not quite a coo either. It was the sound of someone who had been calling for help for so long he'd almost forgotten what he was calling for. Margaret reached into the crib and gently lifted him, and the moment he was in her arms, she understood what Thomas had been trying to tell her. This wasn't just a baby who needed help, this was their baby. She could feel it in the way he settled against her chest, in the way his tiny hand curled around her finger, in the way every maternal instinct she'd ever suppressed came flooding back. "He's perfect," she whispered as Thomas came up behind her. "He's absolutely perfect." Thomas wrapped his arms around both of them, and for a moment, they stood there in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the nursery window, looking like the family they'd always dreamed of being. "He's hungry," Margaret said, noting the way. The baby was rooting against her shirt. "When did he last eat?" "I don't know. Mrs. Chen said he won't take the bottle." Margaret looked around the nursery, taking in the expensive furniture and elaborate decorations. Everything was beautiful and perfectly coordinated, but it was also sterile. There were no personal touches, no signs that this room had been prepared. "With love, have you been up here before?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "This is the first time. Mrs. Chen showed me up when I heard him crying." Margaret moved to the changing table, expertly checking the baby's diaper. It was soaked, and, from the smell, it had been that way for a while. "When did you say the nurse quit?" "Yesterday. And Mrs. Chen has been trying to take care of him by herself since then." Thomas nodded, watching as Margaret efficiently changed the baby's diaper. Her movements were confident and sure, as if she'd been doing this all her life instead of never. "No wonder he won't eat," Margaret said, lifting the baby back up. "He's been so neglected he doesn't trust anyone to take care of him." She walked to the window, gently bouncing the baby and humming softly. Almost immediately, his crying began to subside. Margaret had always been good with children. She'd been the favorite babysitter in the neighborhood when she was a teenager, and she'd been the one everyone turned to when they needed someone to calm a fussy baby at church. "Look at him," she said softly. "He just needed someone to hold him properly." Thomas watched from the doorway, and he felt something shift in his chest. All those years of watching Margaret interact with other people's children, seeing the longing in her eyes when she handed them back to their parents, knowing that she was born to be a mother but might never get the chance. Now, watching her with this baby, he could see that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "We can't leave him here," Margaret said, turning to face Thomas. "I won't leave him here. I know. I don't care about the legal complications or what people will say or whether we're taking too big a risk. This baby needs us, and we need him. Sometimes that's all that matters." Thomas moved to stand beside her, looking down at the baby who had stopped crying entirely and was now gazing up at Margaret with dark, serious eyes. "What should we call him?" Thomas asked. Margaret smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in months. "Michael, after your father, Michael O'Sullivan," Thomas said, trying the name out. "It fits, Michael Thomas O'Sullivan," Margaret corrected, "after both his grandfathers." They stood there for a moment, looking down at the baby who had become their son in the space of 20 minutes. Michael made a soft sound and yawned, his tiny fist uncurling against Margaret's chest. "We need to get him out of here," Margaret said, "and we need to do it now, before Mrs. Chen comes back." Thomas nodded. "I'll get the car seat from the Hendersons' house. They told me last week they were giving away their baby things. There's one downstairs," Margaret said. "I saw it in the mudroom when we came in. Mrs. Chen probably bought it." They worked quickly and efficiently, gathering the baby's things. Margaret found a diaper bag and filled it with formula, bottles, diapers, and a few changes of clothes. Thomas carried the car seat to the truck, his hands shaking slightly as he installed it. As they prepared to leave, Margaret took one last look around the nursery. In a few hours, Mrs. Chen would return and find it empty. Charles Pemberton would come home to discover that his problem had been solved, though not in the way he'd expected. "Are you ready?" Thomas asked. Margaret looked down at Michael, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I've been ready for 23 years. The drive home was surreal. Margaret sat in the back seat next to Michael's car seat, watching his tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. She couldn't stop touching him, smoothing his hair, adjusting his blanket, making sure he was still real. What are we going to tell people?" she asked as they pulled into their driveway. Thomas had been thinking about that. "We tell them we're adopting him. It's not a lie we are adopting him. We're just expediting the process. And if someone asks about the paperwork, We'll deal with that when we have to. Right now, the most important thing is getting Michael settled and healthy." Their house suddenly looked different too. Margaret had always kept it immaculate, but now she was seeing it through different eyes. The living room, where she'd imagined a child playing. The spare bedroom she'd always secretly thought of as a nursery. The kitchen where she'd planned to make birthday cakes and pack school lunches. "He's going to need so much," she said, feeling overwhelmed for the first time. "A crib, a high chair, clothes, toys. We'll get him everything he needs," Thomas said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll go shopping. Tonight, he can sleep in our room." As they carried Michael into the house, Margaret felt as if she was crossing a threshold into a completely different life. Everything was about to change: their routines, their finances, their future. But looking down at the baby in her arms, she couldn't imagine wanting anything else. "Welcome home, Michael," she whispered, and for the first time in years, the word home felt completely right. That evening, as the sun set over Millbrook, the O'Sullivan house was filled with sounds it had never heard before. The soft murmur of lullabies, the gentle splash of a baby's first bath, the satisfied sighs of a well-fed infant finally getting the care he needed. Margaret sat in the rocking chair Thomas had moved into their bedroom, holding Michael while he slept. She couldn't stop looking at him, couldn't stop marveling at the fact that he was really theirs. "Do you think Mrs. Chen is back yet?" she asked. Thomas, who was reading a book about infant care he'd picked up at the drugstore, looked up. "Probably. And she's probably telling Mr. Pemberton that she doesn't know where the baby is." "Do you think he'll call the police?" "I don't know. He might. But Maggie, whatever happens, we did the right thing. Look at him, he's already a different baby than he was this morning. He's eating. He's sleeping. He's not crying constantly. He needed us." Margaret nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to face challenges they hadn't fully considered. Somewhere across town, Charles Pemberton was probably discovering that his son was missing, and eventually he was going to start asking questions. But for now, in this moment, none of that mattered. Michael was safe, he was loved, and he was theirs. Whatever came next, they would face it together. "I love you," Margaret whispered to the sleeping baby in her arms. "I love you so much, Michael. And I promise you, no matter what happens, we'll never let anyone take you away from us." As if he could hear her, Michael stirred slightly, his tiny hand reaching out to curl around her finger. And Margaret knew, with absolute certainty, that she would keep that promise no matter what it cost her. 3 weeks had passed since Michael O'Sullivan had come home, and the transformation in the O'Sullivan household was nothing short of miraculous. The spare bedroom had been converted into a nursery, complete with a crib that Thomas had assembled with the dedication of a man building a cathedral. Margaret had thrown herself into motherhood with the fierce joy of someone who had waited her entire adult life for the opportunity. Michael was thriving. The sickly, crying baby they'd rescued from the Pemberton house had become a healthy, alert infant who smiled at the sound of Margaret's voice and reached for Thomas's finger with surprising strength. He was eating well, sleeping through the night, and had already gained almost 2 pounds. Margaret had never been happier. She woke up every morning with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Her days were filled with feedings and diaper changes, tummy time and lullabies. She'd discovered that she had an instinctive understanding of what Michael needed, often before he even started crying. "Look at him," she said to Thomas one morning, watching Michael kick his legs excitedly during a diaper change. "He's so strong and smart. Watch how he follows my voice." Thomas, who was getting ready for work, paused in tying his shoes to watch his wife and son. The sight never got old. Margaret's face lit up whenever she looked at Michael, and the baby responded to her with obvious adoration. "He knows his mama," Thomas said, and Margaret's heart swelled at the word. She was his mama in every way that mattered. The neighbors had been surprisingly accepting of the O'Sullivans' sudden parenthood. Margaret had explained that they were adopting Michael, and most people had simply congratulated them and offered help. Mrs. Henderson next door had brought over a bag of baby clothes her grandson had outgrown. The Kowalskis down the street had offered to babysit whenever Margaret needed a break. "It's like the whole neighborhood was waiting for us to have a baby," Margaret had told Thomas. "Everyone's been so wonderful, but Thomas had been carrying a weight that was growing heavier. Each day, he'd been watching the local news, reading the newspaper, waiting for some mention of a missing baby. So far, there had been nothing. Charles Pemberton had made no public appeals for his son's return, had filed no police reports that made it into the media. The silence worried Thomas more than an active search would have. It suggested that Pemberton was handling the situation privately, which could mean anything. Maybe he was relieved to be rid of the responsibility. Maybe he was conducting his own investigation. Or maybe he was simply waiting for the right moment to act. Thomas had also been thinking about Mrs. Chen. He'd driven by the Pemberton house several times, but he'd never seen her car. He wondered if she'd been fired, if she'd quit, or if she was simply keeping a low profile. He hoped she was okay, and he hoped she didn't regret helping them. On this particular morning, Thomas was running late. He'd spent longer than usual playing with Michael, making funny faces that sent the baby into delighted giggles. Margaret had teased him about being wrapped around their son's tiny finger, and Thomas hadn't bothered to deny it. "I'll be back by 5, he told Margaret, kissing both her and Michael goodbye. "Mrs. Patterson wants to meet Michael this afternoon. She's been asking about him all week. I'll have him looking his best," Margaret promised. "Won't we, sweetie?" she cooed to Michael, who gurgled in response. Thomas was halfway through his route when he saw the black sedan. It was parked across the street from the Morrison house, and something about it made him uneasy. The windows were tinted, and there were 2 men sitting in the front seat, both wearing suits despite the warm weather. Thomas tried to tell himself he was being paranoid. It was probably just someone waiting for a business appointment, or maybe real estate agents looking at properties in the neighborhood. But as he continued his route, he noticed the sedan following him at a distance. By the time he reached the Henderson house, Thomas was certain he was being watched. The sedan had stayed several car lengths behind him, making the same turns, stopping when he stopped. Thomas's hands were shaking as he delivered the Hendersons' milk, his mind racing through possibilities. Had Charles Pemberton hired private investigators? Was this about Michael, or was Thomas just being paranoid, his guilty conscience making him see threats where none existed? Thomas decided to test his theory. Instead of continuing to his next scheduled stop, he took a detour through the residential streets, making several unnecessary turns. The sedan followed him every step of the way. His radio crackled to life. "Thomas, this is dispatch. Are you running behind schedule today?" Thomas picked up the radio with a trembling hand. "Just a small delay, Jana. I'll be back on schedule in a few minutes." "Copy that. Also, there's a message for you. A man called asking about your route schedule. Wanted to know what time you usually make deliveries to Hillcrest Drive." Thomas's blood ran cold. Hillcrest Drive was where the Pembertons lived. Did he leave a name? Said he was from the city planning department. Something about traffic patterns. But it seemed odd he was very specific about your personal schedule. "Thanks, Jana. I'll be in touch." Thomas set down the radio and looked in his rearview mirror. The sedan was still there, and now he could see that the passenger was talking on a phone. Thomas made a decision. Instead of continuing his route, he turned toward home. He needed to warn Margaret. Margaret was in the living room, sitting on the couch with Michael in her lap. When she heard Thomas's truck in the driveway, she looked at the clock. It was only 2:30. He wasn't supposed to be home for hours. "Daddy's home early," she told Michael, who was chewing on a teething ring. "I wonder what." The front door burst open, and Thomas came in looking like he'd seen a ghost. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he locked the door behind him. "Thomas, what's wrong? We need to talk," he said, moving to the window and carefully looking out through the blinds. "And we need to pack." "Pack? Thomas, you're scaring me." Thomas sat down next to her, taking her free hand in both of his. "Maggie, I think they've found us. I think Charles Pemberton has hired people to watch me." Margaret's face went white. "What do you mean?" "There's been a car following me all morning. 2 men in suits, and dispatch got a call from someone asking about my route schedule, specifically wanting to know when I deliver to Hillcrest Drive." Margaret instinctively held Michael closer. "Maybe it's just a coincidence." "It's not a coincidence." Thomas stood up and began pacing, I should have known this would happen. Pemberton's not the kind of man who just lets things go. He's been planning this. Planning what? To get Michael back. The words hung in the air between them like a physical blow. Margaret looked down at Michael, who was looking up at her, with trusting eyes, completely unaware that his world might be about to change again. They can't take him, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's ours now. He's been ours for 3 weeks. They can't just legally. He's still Charles Pemberton's son. We never filed any paperwork, never went through any official channels. In the eyes of the law, we kidnapped him. Margaret stood up abruptly, still holding Michael. We saved him. He was neglected, abandoned. His own mother wouldn't even hold him. I know that. And you know that. But can we prove it? Mrs. Chen was the only witness, and she might not be willing to testify. For all we know, Pemberton has already gotten rid of her. Margaret began pacing now too, rocking Michael gently as she moved. So what do? We can't just give him back. Look at him, Thomas. He's healthy and happy and loved. If we give him back to that house, I know. Thomas ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Michael had inherited. But if we run, we'll be fugitives. We'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Then we don't run, Margaret said with sudden determination. We fight. Thomas stopped pacing and stared at his wife. Fight how? We don't have money for lawyers. We don't have connections. Charles Pemberton probably has both. We have something he doesn't have, Margaret said firmly. We have the truth, and we have love. That has to count for something. Before Thomas could respond, there was a knock. At the front door, they both froze, looking at each other with expressions of shared terror. Michael, sensing the tension, began to fuss. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Then a voice called out, Mr. and Mrs. O'Sullivan. This is Detective Morrison from the Millbrook Police Department. I'd like to speak with you about a missing child. Margaret felt like her knees might give out. This was at the moment they'd both been dreading and somehow hoping would never come. She looked down at Michael, memorizing his face, trying to imprint every detail in her memory in case this was the last time she would hold him. What do? She whispered. Thomas straightened his shoulders, and Margaret saw a transformation come over him. The frightened man who had burst through their door was gone, replaced by someone who looked ready to fight for his family. We tell the truth, he said, all of it. Thomas opened the door to find a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit, accompanied by a uniformed police officer. Detective Morrison was not what Margaret had expected. He looked more like a tired high school teacher than the hard-nosed cop she'd imagined. Mr. O'Sullivan. Detective Morrison showed his badge. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I'm investigating a report of a missing infant. May we come in? Thomas stepped aside, and the two officers entered the living room. Detective Morrison's eyes immediately went to Margaret, who was still holding Michael, and then to the baby himself. Is this the child in question, Detective? Morrison asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. His name is Michael, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears that were threatening to fall. Michael O'Sullivan. Detective Morrison made a note in his small notebook. Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you some questions about how this child came to be in your care. Are you going to take him away? Margaret asked directly. Detective Morrison looked at her for a long moment. That depends on a lot of factors, ma'am. Right now, I'm just trying to understand what happened. Thomas sat down next to Margaret, presenting a united front. Detective Morrison, before we answer any questions, there's something you need to understand. This baby was being neglected, seriously neglected. His biological parents weren't caring for him properly. According to whom? According to me, Thomas said. I saw it myself. I heard him crying for hours. Day after day. The housekeeper told me his mother wouldn't even hold him, wouldn't feed him. He was sick and getting sicker. Detective Morrison made more notes. And you felt this justified taking the child. I felt it justified saving him. Margaret interjected. Look at him, Detective. Really look at him. Does he look like a child who's been harmed? Does he look neglected or abused? Detective Morrison did look at Michael, who chose that moment to smile and reach for Margaret's face. The baby was clearly healthy, alert, and bonded to the woman holding him. He looks well cared for. Detective Morrison admitted, but Mrs. O'Sullivan, taking a child without legal authority is a serious crime, regardless of your intentions. What about leaving a child to suffer? Margaret asked. Is that not a crime too? The room fell silent except for Michael's soft babbling. Detective Morrison closed his notebook and looked at both of them. Mr. and Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm going to be straight with you. Charles Pemberton has reported that his son was taken from his home 3 weeks ago. He's demanding the child's immediate return. What about Victoria Pemberton? Thomas asked. What does she say? Detective Morrison's expression shifted slightly. Mrs. Pemberton is not available for comment at this time. Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. What does that mean? Margaret asked. It means she's been hospitalized for severe postpartum depression. She's been there since shortly after the baby was reported missing. Thomas felt a surge of vindication. So she was sick. She couldn't care for Michael. That may be true, Detective Morrison said, but it doesn't change the legal situation. Charles Pemberton is the child's legal father, and he wants his son back. To do what with him? Margaret asked fiercely. Put him in another house with another housekeeper while his mother is in a psychiatric hospital. Pass him off to relatives who don't want him. Give him to strangers. Detective Morrison was quiet for a moment. Mrs. O'Sullivan, what if I told you that Mr. Pemberton has already contacted an adoption agency? That he's planning to place the child with a family through legal channels? Margaret felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. You mean he's planning to give Michael away anyway? It appears so. Then why can't he give him to us? Thomas asked. We're the ones who've been caring for him. We're the ones who love him. Because you're not on his list of approved families, Detective Morrison said bluntly. Mr. Pemberton has specific criteria for the type of family he wants for his son. What criteria? Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Wealthy. Connected. What he calls appropriate social standing. Margaret felt a fury she'd never experienced before. So it's not about what's best for Michael. It's about Charles Pemberton's image. Detective Morrison didn't answer, but his expression suggested he was thinking the same thing. Detective Morrison, Thomas said carefully, what happens now? Now I have to make a decision. I could arrest you both right now and turn the child over to social services while this gets sorted out. Or what? Margaret asked desperately. Or I could give you 24 hours to figure out a solution. Maybe find a lawyer. Maybe talk to someone about making this legal. Margaret looked down at Michael, who had fallen asleep in her arms. 24 hours. It wasn't much time, but it was something. Why would you do that? Thomas asked. Detective Morrison was quiet for a moment. Because I have grandchildren, he said finally. And because that baby looks happy and healthy and loved. And because sometimes the legal thing and the right thing aren't the same thing. He stood up to leave, then paused. But Mrs. O'Sullivan, I need you to understand something. Charles Pemberton is a powerful man with powerful friends. If you're going to fight him, you're going to need help. Good help. After the detective left, Margaret and Thomas sat in stunned silence. 24 hours to save their family. It seemed impossible. What do we do now? Margaret asked. Thomas stood up with new determination. Now we find Mrs. Chen. She's the only one who can corroborate our story about the neglect. And then we find the best lawyer we can afford. And if we can't afford a good lawyer, Thomas looked down at his wife and son, and his jaw set with resolve. Then we mortgage the house. We sell everything we own. We do whatever it takes. Margaret nodded. And for the first time since Detective Morrison had knocked on their door, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had 24 hours to save Michael. It wasn't much time, but they had something Charles Pemberton didn't have. They had desperation born of love. And sometimes that was the most powerful force of all. As the sun set over Millbrook, the O'Sullivan family faced their greatest challenge yet, but they would face it together, and they would not go down without a fight. The law office of Catherine Martinez was nothing like what Margaret had expected. Instead of the imposing mahogany and leather she'd imagined, the space was warm and welcoming, with family photos on the desk and children's drawings stuck to a bulletin board. Catherine herself was a petite woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair that she wore in a practical bun. Thank you for seeing us on such short notice, Thomas said as they settled into chairs across from Catherine's desk. Margaret was holding Michael, who had been fussy all morning, as if he could sense the tension surrounding him. Detective Morrison called me last night, Catherine said. He explained the situation. I have to tell you, this is not going to be easy. Margaret had found Catherine's name in the phone book under family law, and when she'd called that morning, explaining their situation through tears, Catherine had agreed to meet with them immediately. It was their only hope of keeping Michael. But it's not impossible, Margaret asked. Catherine studied the baby in Margaret's arms. Michael was alert and responsive, clearly bonded to the woman holding him. Tell me everything, she said. Start from the beginning, for the next hour. Thomas and Margaret told their story. Catherine took detailed notes, asking pointed questions about the condition they'd found Michael in, about Mrs. Chen's statements, about Victoria Pemberton's mental state. She was particularly interested in the timeline, how long Michael had been crying, how he'd responded to care, how he'd thrived in the O'Sullivan home. The key to this case, Catherine said when they'd finished, is going to be proving that the child was in imminent danger when you took him. If we can show that he was being neglected or abandoned, we might have a chance. What kind of chance? Thomas asked. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Honestly, maybe 30%. Charles Pemberton is a powerful man with expensive lawyers, but the fact that he's planning to give the child up for adoption works in our favor. It suggests he doesn't really want to be a father. So what do we do? Margaret asked. First, we file an emergency petition for custody. We argue that the child was abandoned and that you acted as good Samaritans. Second, we find Mrs. Chen and convince her to testify about what she witnessed. Third, we pray. Catherine leaned forward. But I need you to understand something. Even if we win temporary custody, Charles Pemberton isn't going to give up. He has resources we don't have. This could drag on for months, maybe years. Margaret looked down at Michael, who was playing with her necklace, completely oblivious to the legal battle being waged over his future. I don't care how long it takes. He's our son. The filing fees alone will be several $1,000s, Catherine warned. And my retainer is $5,000. If this goes to trial, you could be looking at $20,000 or $30,000 in legal costs. Thomas swallowed hard. Their savings account had about $8,000 in it, their nest egg for retirement. We'll find the money. Catherine studied both of them. Why is this baby so important to you? You could adopt through legal channels, find another child who needs a home. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, her voice soft but steady. We tried for 23 years to have a baby. 23 years of hoping and disappointment and medical bills and heartbreak. We'd finally accepted that it wasn't going to happen for us. She looked down at Michael, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. Then Thomas found this little boy crying and alone and neglected. And everything changed. It wasn't just that we wanted a baby anymore. It was that this specific baby needed us, and we needed him. He's not just any baby. He's our baby. He was meant to be ours. Catherine's expression softened. I understand, and I want to help you, but you need to know that the odds are against us. We know, Thomas said, but we have to try. Catherine nodded. All right, let's get started. While Catherine prepared the legal paperwork, Thomas and Margaret began the most important task, finding Mrs. Chen. They started at the Pemberton house, but it was clear that no one was home. The newspapers were piling up on the front porch, and the lawn was beginning to look overgrown. Maybe she's staying with family, Margaret suggested as they drove through the neighborhoods surrounding Hillcrest Drive. Thomas had been thinking about Mrs. Chen's comment that she didn't know anything about babies. It suggested she didn't have children of her own, which might mean she lived alone. He remembered her mentioning that she shopped at the Asian market on Pine Street. So they decided to start there. The owner of the market, an elderly man named Mr. Kim, knew Mrs. Chen well. She hasn't been in for 2 weeks, he told them in accented English. Very unusual. She comes every Tuesday for groceries. Do you know where she lives? Margaret asked. Mr. Kim studied them suspiciously. Why you want to know? Thomas made a decision to tell the truth. She helped us save a baby who was being neglected. Now we need her help to keep him safe." Mr. Kim's expression changed. "Mrs. Chen is a good woman. She helped people." He wrote an address on a scrap of paper. "She lives here. But be careful, she is very frightened about something." The address led them to a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Chen's apartment was on the second floor, and when Margaret knocked, they could hear footsteps inside. But no one answered the door. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret called softly. "It's Margaret O'Sullivan, Thomas's wife. We need to talk to you about Michael." There was a long pause, then the sound of multiple locks being undone. Mrs. Chen opened the door, looking far older than she had just 3 weeks ago. Her face was drawn with worry, and she kept glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to see someone following them. "You should not have come here," she said, but she stepped aside to let them in. The apartment was small, but immaculate, filled with the scent of jasmine tea and fresh flowers. Mrs. Chen gestured for them to sit on her small couch, then disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a tray of tea. "How's the baby?" she asked. Quietly, "He's wonderful," Margaret said, pulling out her phone to show Mrs. Chen photos. "Look how much he's grown. He's healthy and happy and thriving." Mrs. Chen's face softened as she looked at the pictures. "He looks like different baby." "Much better." "Mrs. Chen," Thomas said gently, "we need your help. Charles Pemberton is trying to get Michael back. We need you to tell a lawyer what you told me that day about how he was being neglected, about Victoria's condition, about Charles's plan to give him away." Mrs. Chen's face went pale. "I cannot. Mr. Pemberton, he knows. I helped you. He fired me that same day. He said if I ever spoke about what happened in his house, he would have me deported." Margaret felt her heart sink. "But you're a legal resident, aren't you?" "Yes. But my immigration status is complicated. I have green card, but I made mistakes on application years ago. Mr. Pemberton says he has lawyers who can find problems. Get me sent back to China." Thomas leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, we understand you're scared, but that baby's future is at stake. If you don't help us, he's going to be taken away from people who love him and given to strangers. Or worse," Margaret added, "given back to a house where he was neglected." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long time, staring into her teacup. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. "That baby was dying when you took him. Not dying from sickness, but dying from loneliness. Mrs. Pemberton would not even look at him. Mr. Pemberton called him it like he was not human." "Will you tell that to our lawyer?" Margaret asked. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "I will tell the truth, but I am very scared. We'll protect you," Thomas promised. "Whatever happens, we'll make sure you're safe." The custody hearing was scheduled for the following week. Catherine had managed to get them temporary custody while the case was pending, which meant Michael could stay with the O'Sullivans until a judge made a final decision. Charles Pemberton had hired one of the most expensive law firms in Connecticut. His lawyer, Jonathan Blackwood, was known for his ruthless tactics and his perfect record in custody cases. The contrast between the two legal teams was stark. Catherine Martinez in her simple gray suit versus Jonathan Blackwood in his $1,000 Italian tailoring. The hearing was held in a small courtroom in the Millbrook Courthouse. Judge Patricia Williams was a stern-looking woman in her 60s who had a reputation for being fair but tough. Margaret sat in the gallery holding Michael, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had come to support them. Blackwood went first, painting the O'Sullivans as well-meaning but misguided kidnappers who had stolen a baby from his grieving father. He argued that Charles Pemberton was the victim of a crime and that his son should be returned to him immediately. "Your Honor," Blackwood said in his polished courtroom voice, "my client is a respected businessman who was dealing with his wife's serious mental illness when his infant son was taken from his home. The defendants took the law into their own hands, depriving my client of his parental rights without due process." Catherine's response was passionate but measured. She called Mrs. Chen to the stand first, and despite her obvious nervousness, the housekeeper's testimony was devastating. She described finding the baby crying for hours while his mother lay in bed, refusing to acknowledge his existence. She testified about Victoria Pemberton's complete detachment from her child and Charles Pemberton's obvious desire to be rid of the problem. Mrs. Chen, Catherine asked, in your opinion, was the baby in danger? Yes. Mrs. Chen said quietly. Baby was very sick, not eating enough, crying all the time. I think maybe he would die if nobody helped him. Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal. He suggested that Mrs. Chen was lying to avoid deportation, that she was exaggerating the situation to justify helping the O'Sullivans steal the baby. But Mrs. Chen held firm, her quiet dignity impressive in the face of his aggressive questioning. Next, Catherine called Thomas to the stand. He testified about hearing the baby's cries, about Mrs. Chen's revelations, about the condition he'd found Michael in. His voice broke when he described holding the baby for the first time. Mr. O'Sullivan, Catherine asked, why didn't you call social services instead of taking the baby yourself? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Because I was afraid that by the time they investigated and decided what to do, it might be too late. That baby needed help immediately, not in a few days or weeks. When it was Blackwood's turn to cross-examine Thomas, he was merciless. He pointed out that Thomas had no legal authority to make such a decision, that he had committed a felony, that his actions were those of a vigilante rather than a concerned citizen. Mr. O'Sullivan, Blackwood said, isn't it true that you and your wife were desperate for a child and saw an opportunity to steal one? We saw an opportunity to save one, Thomas replied firmly. The final witness was Margaret herself. Catherine had been reluctant to put her on the stand, worried that her emotional attachment to Michael would hurt their case. But Margaret had insisted. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Catherine asked, can you describe Michael's condition when you first saw him? Margaret's voice was steady as she described the neglected, crying baby she'd found in the Pemberton nursery. She testified about his failure to thrive, about his obvious hunger and distress, about how quickly he'd responded to proper care. In the 3 weeks he's been with us, Margaret said, Michael has gained 2 pounds, started sleeping through the night, and is meeting all of his developmental milestones. He's a happy, healthy baby who is loved and wanted. Blackwood's cross-examination focused on Margaret's inability to have children of her own, suggesting that her judgment was clouded by her desperation to be a mother. But Margaret refused to be intimidated. Mr. Blackwood, she said, you're right that I've always wanted to be a mother, but this isn't about what I want. This is about what Michael needs. And what he needs is a family who will love him unconditionally, not parents who see him as a burden to be disposed of. The final arguments were emotionally charged. Blackwood argued that the law was clear the O'Sullivans had committed a crime, and Charles Pemberton was entitled to his son's return. Catherine countered that the law was designed to protect children, not to return them to situations where they might be harmed. Judge Williams called for a recess before making her decision. Margaret sat in the hallway holding Michael, surrounded by their supporters, trying not to think about the possibility that this might be their last hour together. When court reconvened, Judge Williams looked tired and troubled. This is one of the most difficult cases I've ever had to decide, she began. On one hand, the defendants clearly broke the law when they took this child without authorization. On the other hand, the evidence suggests that the child was in a situation that could have endangered his health and welfare. Margaret held her breath. However, Judge Williams continued, I cannot ignore the fact that Charles Pemberton is this child's legal father, regardless of his intentions for the child's future. The law gives parents broad discretion in making decisions about their children's care, even if others disagree with those decisions. Margaret felt the world starting to collapse around her. But, Judge Williams said, and the word hung in the air like a lifeline, I am also bound to consider the best interests of the child. This baby has been thriving in the O'Sullivans' care, and there is credible evidence that he was not receiving adequate care in his father's home. Judge Williams looked directly at Charles Pemberton, who was sitting behind Blackwood's table. Mr. Pemberton, is it true that you intend to place this child for adoption? Pemberton's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Pemberton nodded. Yes, Your Honor. My wife is seriously ill, and I don't feel equipped to raise a child alone. And have you considered the O'Sullivans as potential adoptive parents? Blackwood started to object, but Judge Williams held up a hand. Answer the question, Mr. Pemberton. Pemberton looked uncomfortable. They don't meet our criteria for adoptive families. What criteria? Financial stability, social standing, education level. Judge Williams made a note. I see. So this is not about what's best for the child, but about your personal preferences for the type of family that should raise him. Your Honor, Blackwood interjected, my client has every right to, your client, Judge Williams said sharply, has forfeited many of his rights by allowing his infant son to be neglected to the point where strangers felt compelled to intervene. She looked around the courtroom, her gaze settling on Margaret and Michael. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm granting temporary custody to the O'Sullivans for a period of 6 months, during which time Mr. Pemberton can decide whether he wants to voluntarily relinquish his parental rights and allow them to adopt the child. Margaret felt like she might faint with relief if Mr. Pemberton chooses not to relinquish his rights. Judge Williams continued, we'll revisit this case in 6 months and I'll make a final determination based on what's in the best interests of the child at that time. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned. Margaret was crying and laughing at the same time, holding Michael close while Thomas wrapped them both in his arms, round them. Their friends and neighbors were cheering and crying too. Catherine approached them with a cautious smile. It's not over yet, she warned. Pemberton could appeal, or he could decide to fight for custody in 6 months. But we have time. Margaret said, we have 6 months to prove that Michael belongs with us. As they walked out of the courthouse, Margaret looked down at Michael, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely unaware that his future had just